It's an honor to have my brother Gil. I don't know if you know this, but I have my brother Gil, and even my brother Dave was a little bit trained in OD. And then of course my dad trained us all. And so it's a family affair. And if you like Gil, you can get my dad on Monday. He's 93. I would take the opportunity to listen to him and be with him if you can. He's still sharp of mind. His body isn't as good as it used to be, but whose is? I don't know about you, so anyways, it's fun to be here, Gil. I'm not really going to introduce you. I'm just going to let you take it away.
So I'm Gil Crosby, and I began, experiencing life in a way that's relevant to tonight's conversation as a kid. So our father was committed to racial equity back in the 60s. I came into the world in 1959. He was running church camps that were integrated in the segregated South, much to the consternation of some of the church elders, and participating in the civil rights movement and so on, and basically raised us with the belief that anyone that is in a sense powerless deserves support. And so racism, sexism, any isms, values were to fight those isms as best one can. So let me bring up my slide set. This is my book on the right that is about Lewin, and I just have been trained in Lewinian OD by my father and practiced it since 1984 when I first did OD. And it was only till recently that I realized that, somewhat embarrassed realization, that I had not read Lewin. I had read very little tiny snippets, and I knew little quotes, and I knew the theory, a lot of the theory, pretty well, really. I never read it, and I noticed that people were often saying, "Hey, Lewin's outdated. We need new things in OD, et cetera, et cetera. The world has changed," and so I thought that was all basically a bunch of garbage, and still do. But I thought, well, if I think that, I'd better actually figure out what Lewin said and make sure I know what I'm talking about. So I read, he's got reams of stuff he wrote, and I took it and I thought to myself, why don't I organize this? That's what the book's about. And in the process, I got into these topics: Lewin's leadership model. This was the stuff that you were told would be the outcomes today. A systemic approach to racism and all forms of inequality, which Lewin's social science does provide a framework for that, which I think is missing in most DEI conversations and in the broader world. So I think it's time to revive Lewin's approach because it works. And I don't have faith that the current conversation is going to get beyond polarization. And if it's polarized, it'll stay stuck. So how do you get past polarization? That's part of what Lewin worked on. And so that goes with his science of change. Lewin's social science was designed to address all social phenomena, whether it's national culture or whether it's local violence, sexism, racism, changing cultures. Now, I have never prepared as much for a presentation as I have prepared for this presentation in the last couple of days, partially because COVID canceled my week of T group workshop leadership I was going to do this week. And in the process, I said to myself, this part's too much. It's the diversity conversation that I'm really focused on in my preparation. So I apologize if that's a disappointment to you. It's possible I'll get into Lewin's leadership model at the end. Now there's pieces of it I have to get into. I also hate it when people put up big slides and then read them. But I hope you'll bear with me. Perhaps it'd be wise to take a deep breath and close your eyes even. But I want to give you this quote from Howard Thurman to begin today. And this stupid little thing that shows me the screen sharing is happening is in the way of part of it. Okay, I guess I can move it around. So here we go. This really fits how I think about being human. The burden of being Black and the burden of being white is so heavy that it is rare in our society to experience oneself as a human being. It may be, I don't know, that to experience oneself as a human being is one with experiencing one's fellows as human beings. And by the way, Howard Thurman lived through the late 1890s, early, around the same time as Lewin. And he, in this conversation, he was talking about Black and white, but he was certainly aware of other minority experiences and power experiences that go beyond that, gender. So anyway, back to the quote. It means that the individual must have a sense of kinship to life that transcends and goes beyond the immediate kinship of family or the organic kinship that binds him or her ethnically or racially or nationally. He has a sense of being an essential part of the structural relationship that exists between him and all other men and women. I think the editor threw that in. And between him and all other men and women, oh, that's in there twice, and the total external environment. As a human being,
I see Gina Rose struggling on something. Gina Rose, are you okay? Yeah, like a thumb up if you're okay. Okay, thank you.
As a human being, then, he belongs to life and the whole kingdom of life that includes all the lives and perhaps also all that has ever lived. In other words, he and she sees himself as part of a continuing, breathing, living existence. To be a human being, then, is to be essentially alive in a living world. So for me, that part of the essence of Lewin and now Howard Thurman is being able to identify with everybody. And it doesn't mean you have to go through the exact same experience to be able to identify with others and the experiences they're having and to care. And so anyway, that's part of my framework. Now, Lewin, and Chris, thanks for checking with, now I only see, the way I've got this right now, 4 people, including my head, which I like to see. So I've got it there. But when I'm running slides and people do chats, it doesn't just pop up. So please, if you notice anything like that, anyone's trying to get my attention, let me know.
I will.
Thanks. Lewin helped influence the cultural reconstruction of Germany after World War II. So when I say his social science applies to my experience as a human being, an individual, and to larger experiences, I mean it. I mean, his methods influence, here he is with Roosevelt, just in a conversation, his influence, now he died in 1947 before the Marshall Plan really was implemented and so on, but he wrote papers. This book here is a great collection of Lewin papers, including cultural reconstruction and the special case of Germany and so on. He wrote papers talking about what went wrong after World War I, when the victorious nations tried to create a democracy, impose one in Germany. And then how do you do it? How do you actually join and have effective change? And the results, I think, are pretty stunning for where Germany is now today. And Japan, the reconstruction of Japan was influenced by the same thinking. And so I think it applies to the United States. I think we need to reconstruct the United States. And do it right for the first time. So to be stable, a cultural change has to penetrate more or less into all aspects of a nation's life. It's not just going to help if it's diversity trainings in organizations. We need something much broader than that, or we'll stay in the same boat. Now, along those same lines, Lewin recognized that there's power in every group. Power is part of a democracy that, which democracy being the type of political organization that allows for as much influence as possible by the people. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to allow as much influence as I wish I had, but it does, allow that, and it has to allow the leaders that are elected to act. So you have to have leadership and influence mixed in a democracy. And you have to have leadership which will not tolerate intolerance, which is a bit of a paradox because that means you have to be intolerant of intolerance. But part of the dilemma in Germany after World War I was they said, well, let's see, democracy means it's whatever freedom of speech for anybody. And so they just sat passively by while the Nazis rose to power. And that's not necessary, and it's a mistake. It's okay to say, no, we insist that this be a democratic society. And that may mean some restriction of free speech, like the recent restrictions of Twitter accounts for political figures, which I applaud. So that's some of the background of Lewin around, well, how do you influence a whole nation and change cultural problems like prejudice, which he basically said that prejudice is a false hypothesis. So what, for those of you who aren't that familiar with Lewin, he created social science. He basically said to psychology and sociology and anthropology that, well, for one, they ought to be combined, and with history and with math, physics, the physical sciences, the ability to do research using physical science methods should be applied to solving social problems. You can come up with a hypothesis, you can implement your strategy, and then you can test the results. And that came to be known as action research and was the foundation for organization development, the primary foundation for organization development. So in his way of thinking, stereotypes, prejudices are basically wrong concepts. Nobody's better than anybody else. Now, at the time he was saying this, people were actually saying, eugenics, there is a master race. So there was, and whites are better than blacks and so on. Men are better than women. So he was born in Mogilno, which was part of Prussia. It's now part of Poland. And so Lewin was a Jewish male living in the Prussian Empire. And he was very interested for personal reasons in what he called minority relations. And it could be the majority is the minority in this way of thinking in terms of power. So it's really power relations. If one group has power over other groups, That's what he's talking about with minority relations. And so there he was, Jewish in really Germany. He was in the Kaiser's army in World War I and was unable to advance beyond the rank of, I think, lieutenant because of institutional racism. There was actually a rule, you cannot rise above this rank if you're Jewish. So there was overt institutional racism in Germany at the time. Now, Lewin went to the University of Berlin before and after that war and was applying physical science to understanding human behavior. And so one of his theories that I'm going to apply throughout this conversation is that behavior is a function of the personality and the environment. It's a mixture. And you can never completely determine behavior just based on personality or just based on the environment. If you think it's just one or the other, you're making a mistake. There's always some free will. There's always heavy systemic influence. Another part of how he applied physics to understanding social situations is field theory. So that there's always a quasi-stationary equilibrium or homeostasis in every situation. It's true of individual lives. He says there's a life field. At the point we are in our lives and in the systems we're in, we're likely to do certain things. Like I was likely to show up and do this presentation. If I were in a different point in life, maybe I wouldn't have. But at this point, I'm responsible for my professional life, and I'm at a point where this matters to me enough that I wouldn't shirk it. But so there's all kinds of reasons why we continue to do the things we do. And this is true of every group, every organization, every nation. This nation is in a quasi-stationary, because there's always change happening, homeostasis around race relations. What people mostly try to do is drive change, to force solutions, to come up with a strong driving force. And what Lewin's research shows is that increases tension in the system, and it's likely to erode whatever progress gets made, because people will push back. Whatever is the restraining forces will grow in strength. So if all you try to do is impose your will, there's consequences. Instead, to change things, one must decrease the restraining forces. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes it works to say, okay, everyone's going to wear seatbelts. And if you don't wear seatbelts, we'll give you a ticket. And there are times change can be forced through a strong driving force, but generally it doesn't work. It works much better if you can shift. Like right now, our restraining force is polarization. If we could shift from polarization to dialogue with a reasonably large number of the population, then we could change enough to pull along the rest of the population, I think. So here's an example then of Lewin doing change with, he did research activity after research activity. He was trying to help the US government, in this case, the State Department, he was often involved in. This was the Agriculture Department. They wanted to change food habits during World War II. And what wasn't working was to get people in the room and lecture at them. They had very little influence lecturing at people, even if the people were in a group. If you lecture at them, you're basically leaving them in an individual situation They're quietly, passively in their heads. It's not a group experience. It's still an individual student experience. And individuals can resist easily challenges to their beliefs or their values. So what Lewin would do is say, okay, have one group still have this standard lecture with a high quality lecturer. I don't know if any of you have heard of Margaret Mead, but he worked with Margaret Mead and she was the lecturer. And then he would have this second group where the participants would still have Margaret Mead as their lecturer, but she would lecture for a very short period of time, give the basics, and then the participants would talk amongst themselves about the information they've been given, what they think, and they would come up with their own ideas. And when they came up with their own ideas, they would implement them, but at a much higher level, and they would stick with it at a much higher level. And Lewin did that kind of study in industry. He did it with farmers. He did it over and over again. The results were always the same. If you just lecture at people, it generally has very little effect, not enough effect. If you let people think for themselves in an organized manner, they'll go out and get things done and experiment. It won't all work, but a lot of it will work. And they'll own it because it's actually theirs, not because it's been sold to them. And they'll get it done. That's the basis of the whole organization development career I've been in, is helping people come up with their own solutions in an organized way and implement them.
Gil,
Yes.
I have a question about figure 34, unless you're about to get to it.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so it says the consumption of fresh milk. I'm wondering if it's like the production.
No,
Or
it was the consumption.
Okay, and they are drinking milk, or I'm confused by
Look,
this.
honestly, I don't know why the government wanted mothers to increase their consumption of fresh milk,
Okay,
but they did. So
got it.
there's a bunch of these I understand better than this one. Like they wanted food, the best food, the best meat to go to the soldiers, and so on. They wanted college students to eat less Wonder Bread and eat more vegetables in one study, and so on. And they always got the same result. I've never known why did they want these mothers to increase consumption of fresh milk in their families. I don't know. But they got the result they wanted when they did the group decision process. That's what I know.
Okay.
It's a good question.
I was thinking this was like something on oxytocin, where like the women, when they had a group experience of like talking amongst each other, they produced more milk because oxytocin or
No.
No,
No, that's a very creative guess. This was simply, did they implement change? And the change was to use milk, fresh milk. I think, the dietary wise, that could be debatable, whether that's really, I don't know what that was about. But okay, so how are we doing here? We're 35 minutes into this. I think I'll say a little more and then have a little bit of time for maybe some paired conversation before we continue at that point. So here's Lewin talking about the minority experience, which of course he was deep into in his whole life. I mean, he had a hard time getting to the United States. It's not like we had a welcome mat out for Jewish individuals, even during World War II. When you think that we would have, it was very difficult to get here. The University of California, I think, regents that were famous psychologists wrote a note to each other that is in one of the books where they, call Lewin by racial names and make fun of his children. So, he got away from the Nazis and still ended up in a very racist culture, better than where he had been, though. And so here's one way he visualized and thought about what's it like to be in the minority. And again, you could be the majority, but have less power. So what's it like to, the Jewish experience in the Holy Land during the time of Jesus when the Romans were in power? Okay, they were the minority in terms of power. So he believes that when there's a power imbalance, that you're marginal, you're on this margin. And by the way, he took map topography and applied it to understanding social situations, another one of his innovations. And so you're on this boundary. And if you're on the boundary, you're going to wish that you enjoyed the benefits that the majority have of wealth and stability. And, they're all in the, all the top politicians are going to be in that majority group. And, you're going to wish you had all that. And yet you're also going to resent that majority group for good reasons. You're also going to identify with the group that you're most like, but you're also going to resent being part of that group. And it's easy to be very ambivalent and to wish you weren't part of the group and to be very critical of it. And so you don't really belong anywhere, in a sense, when there's power imbalances. And it leaves you wondering, let's say you're a woman in a sexist society, which is pretty much all societies since the First Nation states were created. So ebbing and flowing in terms of inequality, but so there you are, and you don't know if you aren't getting ahead because of sexism, or is it really something about you? And is there something you need to do to develop yourself? And so you'll wonder, my wife's Jamaican. She got here to the United States in 2013. And she realized that she would wonder, is this clerk being rude to me because they're having a bad day? They've got gas, or is it because I'm Black? And, or is it because I'm a woman? You got all these variables. Or is it because of how I behaved with them? What is it? And so there's so much ambiguity that it's easy to think you're being discriminated against when you aren't. And it's easy to not realize that you're being discriminated against when you are. And the whole thing's just crazy making. So that's part of Lewin's perspective on what we do to ourselves when there's inequality. Here's Mel Brooks from High Anxiety. And so another element of this, I'm going to move the slide because I don't want anyone to go crazy looking at that for too long. But another element of it is that you'll have individual personality experiences like feeling anxious. And, Lewin looks at sort of what he called the Jewish character and says, well, of course, Jewish people tend to be anxious. People are killing us. We're not going to get over it by going to psychotherapy. That might help some, okay? It could help me as an individual, but that's not the answer here. The answer is we need to change society, and then we'll be less anxious. If we have an equal society, we'll be less anxious. So it's just the dance between individual and society is constant, and it's real, and it is hard to tell what's what's me, what's out there, what's what I'm experiencing. Here's Germany and what Lewin called the space of free movement, which was very restricted in Germany. There was a hostile legal system, which, certainly rings true in the United States for Blacks in the United States in particular, but not just Blacks, but a hostile legal system. You know that if I know if a cop pulls me over, I'm mostly just dealing with them about the ticket or something. And I know that if I were Black and I were male in particular, and they pulled me over, I'd be worried about my life. So I got to make sure I don't do anything, that might upset this person. And so there's that doesn't mean the whole legal system's hostile, but too much of it is and has been. And then that puts the people in the legal system in that same ambiguity. Of course, they aren't all hostile. And so they're confused about each other probably, and they're also defensive. And it's a mess. It's a mess. So tenure at universities, Lewin was highly regarded at the University of Berlin. He could not be a tenured professor because he was Jewish. They're overt institutional racism. Well, that's what it was. It was overt. There was no hiding it. I know for a fact that in the United States, it's harder to get a loan if I'm Black. It just is. And probably from my bank. I don't know that for sure about my bank, my little bank here in Wilmington, Delaware, but I wouldn't be surprised. I'd like to look at their records and know, but I know broadly that there's, plenty of evidence that that's still unequal. If you have the same income, same history, you're still less likely to get a loan. So, there's all that stuff that's the institution. There's all that stuff that's, that we need to change, that people are talking about, which is good. What Germany ended up with after World War II, after the Reconstruction, was a willingness to admit their history. And so right here on the right is a picture my son sent me recently. He lives in Würzburg, Germany. And he just sent me this photo that's on the street in the town where he lives. And, it's a photo of Jewish people marching to the trains on that street. And so they've accepted in Germany that they have a history that they do not want to repeat. That are not happy about it, but they don't hide it. They put it right out in public, and we're a long ways from that in this country. It's just there's so much polarization around our history, which clearly has stuff like this in it, not just regarding African Americans and slavery, but that's bad enough. But the Native American population and their land that we're living on, and so on. So I think to get to equality means that you have to be willing to be real about your history. And that doesn't mean you have to beat yourself up. It's what you want to move on from. But you can't move on from it if you're not going to admit that it existed. This is the last little piece of Lewinian social science I'm going to dip into tonight. And it's really, I think, important because, it basically Lewin says, hey, our beliefs in our society, we've created them. It's not like they have to be this way. If you were born in Greece in 500 BC, you would speak Greek, of course. And you would also think of the world the way people thought of it at that point, for the most part. And there would be variation. But we come into the cultural waters that we're born into, and we absorb it, and we learn things like how to think about race, or that race even exists. Because if you were born in 500 BC, you wouldn't think, they didn't think in terms of race. They might think in terms of other nations and that they were in conflict with, and ethnic groups. But skin color as a form of race just wasn't something that people apparently were aware of or thought anything about. And so there was just, we realizing that we're socially constructing reality is freeing, I think, and it also gives me responsibility to think about my beliefs and so on. Certainly, any kind of belief like I'm better than somebody else, I think is a crazy belief. It's a false hypothesis, and but if you think that things are not socially constructed, then you must think that they're somehow like divinely constructed or something. I think everything's divine, but I don't think social reality is handed to us. So that's some of my bias. Well, look, that's a lot.
So you want
Yes.
to like do some breakout rooms or something, Gil?
Yeah, I think so. And I see what you wrote, Joe, and I agree. And unfortunately, now there was like gender and, and sexism. And of course, it was done in different ways. But that was one of the ways that people took physical characteristics and used them to divide people and have power over them. Which is
Gil,
always a mistake.
Do you want to be in these pairings?
I think I'd rather step back and just sort of reflect and think about where I am.
Okay.
And I just, by the way, the intent of the pairings, maybe you're used to this with PNODN, is I just want you to have a few minutes to think out loud and say what you really think so far. And say how you're really feeling, and if you think that I'm full of beans, I hope you say that to the person you're with. I'm not, I value you being yourself in this conversation. So
this is where my question was, how does Lewin make that change in all aspects of the system so that the culture will be stable, can stay stable? But I kind of can see that happening.
Well, the main way it was done, the main way he does it is through groups, and groups having dialogue. And so in Germany, they literally had groups meeting all over Germany. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this later. But they and Japan, they didn't go in and say, here's how you need to structure your government and so on. They went in and said, they did more like what Lewin suggests. Here's some information, but what do you think? The groups figured out how they were going to move forward, and it was tricky. I mean, because like Lewin pointed out in some of his papers, you're going to have people in the groups that helped send people to concentration camps or even worked in the concentration camps, and members of the SS, and so do you just try to keep all those people out? He said that would be a mistake. You've got to start with what is real here and bring people together. So that's now getting the whole country to shift would take a leader too that thought the same way, that was willing to move in that direction, or a groundswell interest in that direction. I mean, I'm not sure what it would take to get us there. Obviously, Germany didn't have a choice. They had lost. So, yes, Joe. As in South Africa, having people talk about the truth as they saw it, and not just silence people. So, does that make sense, Gina? Is it Gina
Yeah.
Rose?
It is.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I've read about dialogue and how that can be really powerful if everybody just had an open mind, and I guess they're able to face their oppressors too.
I think if it's led right, it's okay if people don't have an open mind at first. So you have to lead it in such a way that people feel respected in the process. And so that's some of what I mean, I'll get into this in a minute about some of my concerns about how diversity is talked about.
What do you mean by respect?
Well, I mean that there's a genuine respect for each person, and that's part of that means letting them, finding ways where they're willing to talk and think out loud. And so, Justin, you've been in a tea group that Chris led, and I led a little of it. I mean, having that process is built around people thinking for themselves. We give information about what we think is important for people to know, like Lewin's social science. But you had to think for yourself about, well, who are you and what are you about and why do you do what you do and how do you want to be? And that's how it has to be. We could tell you.
Respect is about like social agency.
I don't know for sure what you mean by that, but it's certainly about you thinking for yourself.
If you mean agency is my ability to chart my own life, Justin, then I would say yes to that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah.
Within boundaries. Like if you want to chart your life by, being violent against somebody, then I'd say no to that. There has to be some boundaries.
Yeah, I would think about respect is encouraging social agency for all. So I would think that it would be paradoxical to be building up someone's social agency so they could take away someone's social agency.
But it's possible to do that. That is part of what happened according to Lewin in post-World War I Germany. So, okay, now you're all part of a democracy. Oh, well, that means we get to have as much influence as anyone else, said the Nazis, and we have free speech. And well, no, would have been better if they didn't. So, there's a point where if your free speech is to say that other people deserve to die because of their ethnicity or something, then that's poison. So it's within boundaries. So this is where we were. So, just this is a very brief history here. And one of my main sources, right there, you see the matrix of race. Rodney Coates is a colleague. He's spoken for PNODN, I think. And so he's the member of the trio here that wrote this that I know the best. But I think it's a pretty balanced approach. It's a scientific approach to this topic. And so, but just to, so race is not a thing. There certainly is different pigmentations, different general physical characteristics based on DNA and ancestry, and but the actual thought that there's distinct races and that they somehow that have any kind of particular characteristic is a social thought. It's not a scientifically valid fact. And so back in 1493, the Pope at the time said, well, it's okay to go and Christianize all the people in really Central and South America, is what he was talking about, to the Portuguese and the Spanish in the name of the church, and you may rule over them. Now, it's actually, I just read this thing again, and it could have been nice. If you read it, I'd like to talk to that Pope. He doesn't say go enslave them and take their land and murder them and take all that. He doesn't say that. He just says that, reach out, in the name of Jesus. And it didn't get implemented. The implementation was a lot different than what's on that piece of paper, I think. But it was a document that said it's okay to take over, to rule in the name of this belief system. And so off they went. That was one of the first times where it was sort of put into race. Like, we're better than these people. We know better than these people. And by the way, we need their land and so on. And then the first Africans in North America were the same as the Europeans. A lot of the Europeans that were sent there first didn't want to go. They were sent there as against their will as laborers. They had very little choice, as did the first Africans, but they weren't slaves, and they weren't thought of as slaves. And there was none of this, skin color mattering thing at the time. You either were the rulers, the wealthy class from Britain, or you were the poor. And the British system was brutal to the poor. They could do whatever they wanted with the women, and I mean they could whip and beat and punish and imprison the men, and it was all part of the legal system. If the landowner was upset with you and you were poor, the authorities would come and take care of you. And that's just the way it was. So that's what we started with here in the United States. That's a lot of the tradition. I mean, there was, some valiant tradition too and all that, but a lot of it was not so valiant. And so then in 1572, and in many other cases, as I'm understanding, as I study this stuff about race, the British, pale-skinned British, and the Maroons of Panama, who had escaped the Spanish, Africans who had escaped the Spanish, formed an alliance. The Drake loved these Maroons, thought they were, just valiant, intelligent. They took care of the British took care of them. They were brothers in arms against the Spanish. So there wasn't this inherent racism. Racism really came out of, as I understand it, class struggle, and then at least the black-white racism in the US, class struggle, and then slavery. So there was white servitude in colonial America, and then there was the Bacon Rebellion. So there were many rebellions. People didn't like being treated like crap even before slavery, and they didn't like being slaves. They were constantly rebelling, running away, and so there was a lot of trouble for the authorities. And then there was this big rebellion, the Bacon Rebellion, where there were 200 Africans and 600 poor whites. They pretty much killed everybody in the ruling class, almost wiped out the Virginia colony. The British had to ship over soldiers. And they crushed it finally. And after that, they said to the poor whites, look, you're better than the Africans. You're white, like us. They're black. They're slaves at the bottom here. You can have jobs beating them and policing them. And, because you're better than them. This started to get into the structure and the language. And at the same time, they were making huge amounts of money off tobacco. So there was all this money involved, this potential profit. They needed cheap labor. So that got into the whole African slave trade. After that, that's when they started basing it on skin color in this country. And then, the whole history of Chinese laborers in this country was just as brutal and awful. And there were like, if you came here as a laborer from China, you couldn't bring your wife. There were all kinds of restrictions. Those laws weren't changed until, it's like in the 1900s, some of the laws. Of course, you all know about the internment camps and so on during World War II of the Japanese Americans. That's institutional racism going wild. And so we got into this classification in this country of race as part of government policy, and it's still there. It's interesting in the census. It's been 20 years now. They say there's you can list yourself as multiracial, and I'm going to from now on. I'm sick of this other crap. But the whole idea, so they came up with Hispanic. They said, okay, all people who have Spanish as a native language are Hispanic. Well, and it seems like a thing now, right? But it's not. I mean, it's just something the US government came up with to classify people. Same with Asian. I mean, talk about like a made up fantasy. It's all the largest population in the world all thrown into one bucket. And with all kinds of differences, of course. And then India is part of that. If you are from India in the US Census, you're Asian. And of course, if you're from very diverse places like the Philippines or Japan or China, China's got huge diversity. So there's all this fantasy about these groupings that seem real because they're official, and then policy gets created around them. And then there was this whole inclusion of groups that at first, the Irish, for instance, according to the British, were connected to Africans and their inferiority. Somehow they got to the islands, and they're really, science shows that they're an inferior race. And the first slaves in the U.S. were Irish. They had recently finally conquered Ireland, and they were brutal. They just took people and stuck them on ships and brought them to the U.S. The same stuff. So it's all a fabric. It's all a system, a systemic, institutional system that we've created that we need to get rid of it. I mean, it's, there's no reason for it at this point. So now here's Lewin applying social science to address racism. I see there's some other stuff here now. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. And here's Lewin in the middle at the 1946 conference at New Britain Teachers College in Connecticut. They were dealing with racial tension in the state of Connecticut and looking for equity, working on equity around jobs, access. Things were worse then than they are now. And so he applied his social science to these issues over and over again. That's all I just want to have you get. So segregation versus integration in public housing. When they first had public housing in the US, Lewin was involved in, let's see if you put people together what influence that has on their attitudes about prejudice, and if you keep them segregated. And in the two buildings that were segregated, the views about the stereotypes and the views about race stayed stuck. And in the two buildings in the study where they integrated people, they became much more connected across, the race designations. And so generally, I think it's true with structure. If you integrate people, it's better than if you segregate them. So now that applies to organization development. If you get management and labor together, that's better than keeping them apart. If you get maintenance and production together, it's better than, you can't fix it by keeping people apart. Community prejudice self-assessment, I need to get a hold of this. There were all these communities that were doing a self-assessment, but with survey questions of prejudice in their community. And this just got launched when Lewin died, so I don't know how far it went. Gang behavior, there was conflict and violence. And so what Lewin did was he had a social scientist join in with the gang, get to know them, that is, earn their trust, and then help the gang think about, well, what would make a difference here, like public transportation and social activity and other ways for them to spend their time. It was very successful. Lewin sued the entire, the medical school of Columbia University, but it was for the entire university system in the United States that had implications, because the medical school of Columbia University, they denied it always, but they had a quota. You could only have like 3 Jewish students per year. So he used the legal system as a action research. People in New York City were afraid that if there were African-American clerks in their store, their customers were stopped coming. So Lewin did a study where they had clerks of, African-American clerks, and it didn't stop their customers from coming. So, and then finally he was in this thing on race relations in Connecticut, and where he brought in the whole community. So the business leaders, the newspaper editors, he recognized the power structure. And so to change it, he included them as much as they were willing to be included. Now that particular workshop is also where the T group got invented. So 75 years ago. And I went to the same spot and it had this rather silly picture of myself standing kind of like Lewin just a few weeks ago. But T groups are a group method for you to think for yourself about who you are and what's going on between you and other people, and to learn about yourself. So it's based on the same dynamics that Lewin applied to any kind of change. This is, I'm not going to read this whole quote. It's, and I think we're going to take this break in a second, but he thought that you have to eventually raise the self-esteem of groups that have been trampled on. You have to lower this inflated self-esteem of people who think they're better than anybody else. You've got to create a new homeostasis where there's, where people see themselves with equal self-esteem. So with that note, let's take 5 minutes and do whatever you need to do to, be fresh for the last bit of this. Because this is where the fun begins. Re-education. It's a paradox. Now, this is what Lewin called helping people learn to think different. He called it re-education. And I know that there's been use of that term by like totalitarian states and so on. So, but anyway, that was his way of talking about education, you could say, around these kinds of issues. So here's the paradox. You can't, teaching people to respect each other, which is a democratic behavior, and to be willing to follow and to be willing to lead and to help each other, to be willing to influence as a follower in a democratic society, to play a role. None of that can be learned by autocratic means. You can't force people to do it and have them know how. So now Lewin thought that meant that we had to have all of our schools be different, not just, teach autocratically things like the history of democracy, and have kids just memorize the right answers instead of thinking. And he was very clear about that in the reconstruction of Germany, that they need to have their education system teach in a way that encouraged people to think for themselves. So they in a way, they got to a fresh start. That it's exciting to me, even where they are now. To create such a change, the democratic leader has to be in power and be able to hold his or her power. So you have to be willing to say, look, this is what we're working towards. We're working towards people respecting each other and treating each other equally and eliminating institutional racism, sexism, etc. You have to be willing to assert and to allow leaders to assert if it's going to change. As a member of a democracy, we have to play a role which includes responsibility towards the group and sensitivity towards others' feeling. And that includes everybody. Everybody has to learn to the best of their abilities to pay attention to the effect they're having on others. It's not just limited to like one group that they have to be sensitive and everyone else can be insensitive. Doesn't work. There has to be balance. Lecturing doesn't work. Re-education can't be merely rational. That is just a thought process. You have to let people interact with each other and experience each other emotionally. The experts knowing the facts doesn't have any influence unless the group comes to their own conclusion about the facts. So telling people that racism is bad and that they're racist and not being racist is good, and lecturing at them and telling them that isn't really going to create change. And in spite of whatever status differences there might be between them, the teacher and student have to feel as members of one group. If it's about values, if it's about beliefs. So Lewin in industry, the psychologist, really, he had people working for him. They would go in and meet the people and connect with the hourly workers. They wouldn't say, we're the experts, we know better than you. It's just not how they approach things. They would join. And I believe that that is essential for any real change, is that the people leading the change are able to join with the people that they're trying to influence. And it needs to be done through group dynamics. If you just lecture at people, it's still an individual experience. You're having mostly an individual experience here tonight. And it's the best I think I can do under the circumstances. But if you have strong beliefs that are different than mine, I'm probably not going to influence them this way. So re-education is endangered by, here's what Lewin said, and this is a long time ago, so he didn't see what's happening today with DEI or whatever, but it's in danger of only reaching the official system of values, the level of what people say, not necessarily what they do. If all it does is increase the discrepancy between the superego and the ego, the way I ought to feel, the critical adult, and how I actually feel, and by feel I think he means think. If I'm just being told I should think different than how I actually think, then it's not going to stick. I'm just going to be stressed by it. And what's worse, according to Lewin, is I'll probably be a bigger jerk later. It's going to postpone maybe me acting on some beliefs like I'm better than women, or I'm better than African Americans, or whatever, because of how I look. But it's going to make the transgressions more violent later because of the pent up frustration and embarrassment and resentment and defensive-ness. And so you have to let people, you have to engage people in a way where they're actively involved in really thinking about the problems that are being addressed. And if they're not really engaged in the dialogue, they're not going to get convinced by alleged facts like racism is bad and so on. The best way to have people shift their beliefs is by discovery of these facts by the group members themselves through their own interactions. And now this theory of Lewin's came out of working with group after group after group after group, where people said, no, thank you, government. We don't want you telling us how to farm. And then when Lewin worked with them and they could think for themselves and have dialogue, they went out and changed how they farmed. And they adapted some of what the government wanted them to do to handle irrigation differently during the Dust Bowl years and so on. So this isn't just Lewin's thinking, it's Lewin's thinking based on research. The laws of social science. Did someone say something?
Yep.
Yeah. Can I call you Gil?
Sure, absolutely.
Gil, can you define what you mean by re-education as opposed to education?
You're trying to change people's beliefs and values. That's the difference between, where, like, if I go to school right now and try to learn more information, I'm not necessarily, the goal isn't necessarily to change my beliefs and values. It might be my goal, but so that's the main thing I think that he meant by re-education.
Sounds like behavior change.
Well, also
Or
thinking.
attitudinal change.
What's that?
Or attitudinal change, or maybe real change.
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, it's not real change if I think something different than what and if I have, that's the belief. It's beliefs, at the level of beliefs, I think. And so there's more here about that. So hopefully that'll help clarify it. I'm almost done, actually, too. So look, the laws of social science don't change based on the environment. This formula still applies. If you live in a racist time and place, it does not mean that behavior and personality are determined by the environment. They're influenced by it. Behavior and personality are not always unbiased if you're in the minority, and it's not always biased if you're in the majority. It's just not automatic like that. Okay, which I think is some of the lesson, the message that I hear and read around this topic. And so then if you say to people, look, you're always biased because you're part of the majority group, the group in power, physiologically at least, if not in any other way, then yes, people get defensive, and it leads to a counter reaction, potentially. I have a counter reaction to that message. So claiming behavior and personality are always biased or unbiased based on environment, it's a flawed hypothesis. And so I think Lewin's way of joining instead of shaming is the way I want to work on any kind of change. And certainly has been how my brother and my father and I have worked on change in organizations for decades. So I believe it works. People can learn not to just blame others. Even if that was their habit, they can learn not to, and they can learn to think differently. They can learn to think differently, behave differently, if it makes sense to them. And if it's not done in a way that like just says they're screwed up, it doesn't, you're not going to get there. So the laws of social science don't change based on the environment. Now, this is the interpersonal gap. I'm not going to try to teach this model right now. Hopefully you've already become familiar with it at some point in your life. But misunderstandings, I am always interpreting what other people mean and what their actions mean. It's just life. I don't necessarily always understand them the way they intend to be understood. And if there's high intensity, emotional intensity, I'm more likely to misunderstand. And if I don't know that, I'll just blame them. You meant to do this. So that I think is relevant to the whole concept of microaggressions. So to me, the concept is valid. Absolutely. If I say like about Obama, well, he's really well spoken for a Black man. I mean, that's a microaggression, and that's one I'm aware of. When it's that stupid and open. But there's ones I'm not aware of. I'll buy that I may have biases that I'm not aware of. And so the concept makes sense. The assumption that every time I think there's a microaggression, there does not make sense. That to me is another false hypothesis. So in order to really get equality, people have to take responsibility for how they're sending, but also for how they're receiving. And saying that just because there's trauma, I'm traumatized, I'm in a group that's been traumatized, that it's always the other group's fault from now on. So women still are living in a sexist society. So it's always men's fault if they feel offended. That's crazy. That would be crazy. It may be my responsibility at times if someone feels offended, absolutely. But to generalize it is crazy. So now, some of you may be very fond of Robin DiAngelo. I agree with her on many things. Absolutely, there's institutional racism in this country, for instance. But these are some what I consider questionable hypotheses that I think inflame the conversation instead of help create real change. So only whites can be racist. That's a quote. I mean, I've took it right out of her book as I put these slides together. She explains that she means that in a society that has institutional racism, if you're white, you're automatically racist just by being in that culture. And that's a lot of explaining that has to be done, I think. And people take offense. And then she says, I don't know, don't know why they're offended so easily. And it's a defensiveness is a sign of racism. I think that's a circular argument that it's a false hypothesis. So anyone can be racist or any prejudice. And racism is a breeding ground for more racism. So that's why it's important to me not just to accept it. If my wife, who's Jamaican and dark skinned, says that Chinese people are all like such and such, and you can't tell me that there's that any kind of racism isn't racism because that group can't be racist. You just can't tell me that. So anyway, so institutional racism is real, absolutely, but that doesn't rule out individual differences, and it doesn't make every individual racist that's in a racist society, that's in the group that's been in power. anyway, I think there's many serious flaws, I think, to how we're approaching this. Categorizing people as white and so on. I mean, it makes sense. This to me is, I'm not sure what to do with this, but my alarm bells go off. Like, really? Race is socially constructed to create a power structure over people. And we're going to use the same terms while we talk about each other. I mean, there's something wrong about that, I think. And again, you know, it's easy to do, white, black, male, female. So I understand, and I'm not, but okay. So here, implicit bias is always at play. I know that, like, I watched this film the other day. It was about bias. I missed a whole bunch of stuff that was going on because I was focused on something else. And that was the intent of the film, was to show that, you know, you miss what you're focused on is what you see. Absolutely. And if we weren't able to focus, we'd be a mess. And so, and we lose a whole bunch by focusing. And so we all have that process in our consciousness as part of consciousness. And it's not necessarily proof that we're screwed up. But we might be. I might have a prejudice I'm not aware of. Then, you know, I hope I've become aware of it, because you know, I want to do my best to overcome it. But how defensive we become when these things are named, Robin asks, and I think defensiveness has many causes, including being told that you're racist automatically, and it's not necessarily bad either, feeling defensive. So here's Rodney Coates, who wrote The Matrix of Race. This is what he said in my Lewin book. Microaggression and blind spots are the wrong way to start conversations about diversity. For if there are these deep-seated hostilities, biases, microaggression, and blind spots, then there should also be a corollary set of deep-seated fundamental values of goodwill that extends to all, regardless of identities. Conversations that begin and end with the former, and I'm in a group right now, I started last Tuesday, it's a DEI group, and they start right out with wanting us to see our blind spots and our biases. And you know, actually, it's I have mixed feelings about the group, but that's how it started. So anyway, he's saying starting that way, if you stay stuck that way, for sure. If you end and begin, forget it, because people are just going to walk out feeling defensive.
Gil,
And
by the way, on the last slide, Mary pointed out a misspell.
No.
Yeah. Your quote about implicit bias, you wrote it implicate instead of implicit.
Implicate. Thank you.
You'll want to fix that later.
Someday.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Now look, these are just sources. So these are sources for Lewin. Great sources, including my book is a great source. And these are sources that I drew from just to learn about this general topic. Including Robin DiAngelo. I read that book very carefully. And so, you know, I just thought I'd throw that at you. And there's more. There's a lot more. I know there's a lot more. Man's Most Dangerous Myth came out in like the 1940s, 1945 maybe, and had a big influence on our dad. And the most dangerous myth is race, the fallacy of race, that there is such a thing. And then this is my book that comes out Wednesday on Amazon, Spirituality and Emotional Intelligence. I've taught a lot about emotional intelligence. I include things like Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote about anger as a righteous emotion to motivate action. And that's a paraphrase. So, you know, I include social justice as part of this exploration.
in the time left, Gil, I'm hoping that you're
Yes.
open for comments, questions, any kind of
Absolutely.
conversations.
We have 10 more minutes.
Yeah.
And so last thing, Chris, Diversity Without Dogma, that's my next book.
Okay.
And this is all part of my researching, writing that book.